All right.
Welcome to the Critical Christian Podcast.
We're your hosts, Dan.
And Justin. And we're going to ask some critical questions about the Bible and provide some questionable answers.
Whether you like it or not.
It looks like, according to the background that was made for this episode, that we're in 15 and 16.
Okay.
So let's get right into chapter 15.
All right.
Can you read the first two verses for us?
Sure can. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, Do not be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield, your exceedingly great reward. But Abram said, Lord God, what will you give me, seeing I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eleazar of Damascus?
And I saw you have a note on this. Dan, do you care to read for us?
Sure. So after all this, he still talks back to God. Poor Eleazar, right? He was about to be paid, and now probably he gets the dubious honor of being buried alive next to his master.
I mean, that's basically it, right?
Yeah.
That does speak, though, to the nature of servanthood in the biblical time period of Abraham. Remember previously last week we spoke, or we touched on the topic of slavery and how quite often slaves were of war, but they could have been paid servants as well, depending on the context. It's possible also that they could be unpaid servants, but all that aside, we see here that Abraham has a servant that is at least esteemed enough that he is...
I mean, that's pretty esteemed.
I would say so.
And I'd get all stuff when he dies.
Right, because there has to be a man to take over the household when Abraham's gone, right?
Clearly, we can't give it to his wife or anything.
Clearly, the females are not allowed to have any amount of autonomy or political power or financial power.
Right.
You got to keep them in line. Got to keep them having babies. That's part of the be fruitful and multiply thing.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But I mean, that is a really interesting point, is poor Eleazar, because I mean, what if he kind of got excited about
Right.
being next in line and now he's just, nobody again.
Right.
Yeah. I'm going to read 3 through 6.
All right.
Then Abraham said, Look, you have given me no offspring. Indeed, one born in my house is my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, saying, This one shall not be your heir, but one who will come from your own body shall be your heir. Then he brought him outside and said, Look now towards heaven, and count the stars if you are able to number them. And he said to him, So shall be your descendants. And he believed the Lord, and he accounted it to him for righteousness. Any thoughts, Dan?
Only a couple. Like, for instance, Abraham believed him right up until he didn't.
Right.
And I like how people always use these stories as proof that if God were to give, say, me or anyone else wealth, prosperity, whatever, we too would still doubt him. Kind of like how Adam and Eve messed up, but anyone in their shoes would have done similarly, except I don't think anyone would have. It's like, oh, you want God to bless you? Well, this one guy was blessed and didn't appreciate it very much, so obviously that will happen to you as well.
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. Abraham seems to be, we'll say, not a great role model
Right?
for the father of all of the nations of the world to be blessed by. Right? It just seems like almost like, are you sure about that, God? He doesn't seem to be fully on board.
No.
Yet here we are.
Here we are.
And how many faiths are now birthed from the Abrahamic line?
I'm going to say 3.
Yeah, 3 major ones that we know of. Yeah. It is interesting as well that...
I mean, to be fair, they could have picked anybody.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Right.
It's not like Abraham was a special person, you know?
Right.
I'm just saying.
Well, I'm trying to think if there are better... So, are there better examples than Abraham? And the interesting thing is we've got people like Enoch, right? And Elijah.
Yeah.
They were so beloved by God that they were assumed into heaven. Why not pick them to start the royal, holy lineage for all of eternity to bless all mankind?
I'm sure it's something to do with, imperfections, whatever,
Yeah. God using the imperfect to accomplish his will.
I guess if you're perfect, you probably aren't going to need God as much, right?
Perhaps. I do think, though, if we look at Abraham as a person, he does kind of reflect ourselves more than some of the other characters in the Bible. And so it does become sort of a endearing figure because you can see yourself in Abraham making the same mistakes.
Except I can't.
Oh, well, you can't see yourself sleeping with your wife's maidservant?
Shockingly, no.
Right?
Yeah.
But if it was built into the culture, if it was an acceptable practice.
People always just blame the culture at the time,
Right.
Like for slavery, it was acceptable at the time, or racism, it was acceptable at the time.
Yeah.
You know? But some things just are never acceptable.
Right.
If you ask me.
Right.
And this is.
What do you think in our time is going to be completely unacceptable 200 years from now?
Well, racism. We're trying to get rid of it, but it's still everywhere, of course.
Well, I think humanity as a whole recognizes that racism is bad, even though we haven't eradicated it. I'm saying, what cultural practices are generally accepted as okay today that possibly 200 years from now they're going to think, look at those, terrible, heathens that were still doing X, Y, and Z.
Well, I don't know, treating women. I don't know. We've been doing all right with the women, right?
We're doing better.
I'm saying there's definitely room to improve, and I presume in 200 years, it'll be a lot different,
Yeah.
I hope, hopefully there'll be actual, genuine equality,
Right.
But right now, I think we still have quite a lot of room to improve.
Yeah. Is it possible to know today what will be immoral tomorrow?
Listen, I appreciate what you're trying to say, but I feel like yes.
Okay.
Because you should just know innately the difference between right and wrong.
Interesting. But so many people don't.
Yeah, well, it's not my fault.
Right.
If I were Adam, I would not have eaten the fruit. That's all I'm saying.
That's a fair point. Yeah, I think that's an obvious thing not to do since God created the universe kind of told him not to.
Right.
Then again, he didn't have any knowledge.
All right. How about with Abraham? We've already shown that God does a lot of stuff for Abraham. They have a relationship. Everything's going well. And God says, hey, I'll give you a child. He's like, that's great. Then a few years later, he's like, you know what? I better have sex with my wife's whatever.
Yeah, that's a good point. And, we haven't got there yet. We're going to get there.
Yeah.
But I would preface it with this. The time span between the promise of Abraham and actually having the offspring was, roughly 15 years. Mm-hmm. Think in your own life, say you have a religious experience where you feel like God has promised you a thing, and then 15 years later, you don't have that thing.
Okay, let me ask you a question. What was the lifespan back then for Abraham?
Well, we can find out right now. You would think that two great Bible scholars would know the answer to Abraham's age at death.
Uh-huh.
But I don't recall. So we're going to Google it. And according
175.
According to the internet, he was 175. You find that to be dubious or?
Obviously it's dubious, but we're taking this at face value, right?
Yeah, we are.
So I'm just saying, I don't,
So I guess 15 years to Abraham is roughly equivalent to 8 years for us.
And you're saying we couldn't wait. Here's the thing. We're saying this as if this was the first thing God promised him.
True.
But they've all apparently had quite a relationship,
The text would make it appear Yeah, that God has a relationship with Abram at this point.
Yeah. So,
But we don't know how often
right.
these encounters are happening. Maybe years and years apart. It's hard to say. And when you have great spans of time in between events, the mind starts to work on itself. You start to think, well, did that really happen? Did God really promise the way that I thought he did? Or did I misunderstand the promise?
I don't know. All I know is if
Mm.
God were talking to me, I probably wouldn't mess it up.
Yeah. I feel like that's one of those things that's easier said than done.
I don't think so.
All right, well, with that,
Yeah.
let's move into verses 7 through 12. Dan, I'll read, and then you've got some comments
Sure.
here that I want to cover.
All right.
Then he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to inherit it. And he said, Lord God, how shall I know that I will inherit it? So he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Then he brought all these to him and cut them in two down the middle and placed each piece opposite of the other. But he did not cut the birds into two. And when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. Now when the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell upon Abram, and behold, horror and great darkness fell upon him. So it's a rather cryptic, kind of a cryptic passage
A
here.
little bit.
Yeah. What are your thoughts?
Well, this is obviously foreshadowing.
Oh, tell me more.
Okay. I know back in the day people cared more about their legacies,
Sure.
but I still question what comfort there is in knowing that centuries after you're dead, some people you don't know will finally be free.
That's a good point.
I know that, I mean, it's a lot of generations of slaves.
Yeah.
You know? I mean, prophecies would be a lot more impressive if they weren't written like 1,000 years later.
Right.
Just throwing that out there as well.
Yeah.
I mean, I bet I could get all the lottery numbers correct if I guessed a day after the lottery.
Sure.
It's like they looked at the history and they were like, well, better try to explain that somehow. Oh, I know. We'll say it was God's plan all along.
Well, and I think that's part of where we would say faith and progressive revelation come into play.
Progressive revelation.
Yeah,
What's that?
progressive revelation is basically the idea that God only gives humanity a certain amount of divine revelation at a time. And so humanity knows a little bit now, they'll know a little bit more later, and a little bit more later on after that. And that is seen, throughout Scripture, whereas we would say, why wouldn't God just download everything, boom, to the Israelites and just be like, this is exactly how I intend it to be in the end. We're going to fast forward from here to the end. Progressive revelation says, no, there's a process between the beginning and the end.
Is there, though?
Well, I'm not saying I endorse this theory. I'm just saying that's the progressive revelation is how we kind of account for what seems to be the changing landscape of Old Testament theology. But one of the really interesting things here is, the author, in a lot of the sacrificial texts in the Pentateuch, there seems to be kind of an explanation as to what's happening. But there's really no good explanation for this particular ritual. I mean, the text does not tell us. It assumes that we know what's happening. But if someone told me, bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and we're going to, kill some animals and make a covenant here. I mean, it seems odd.
I mean, and he says he cut them down in two down the middle. I mean, obviously he knew what was going on, right?
Right. Yeah. This particular ritual obviously was known to Abraham.
Yeah.
Yeah. So while I don't really have any information from the ancient Near Eastern texts about this particular covenant ritual that Abraham performs, there is an allusion to it that shows up in Jeremiah 34:18 through 20. It says, those who have violated my covenant and have not fulfilled the terms of the covenant they made before me, I will treat like the calf they cut in two and then walked between its pieces. The leaders of Judah and Jerusalem, the court officials, the priests, and all the people of the land who walked between the pieces of the calf, I will deliver into the hands of their enemies who want to kill them. Their dead bodies will become food for the birds and the wild animals. So here it's either a reference to the covenant ceremony of Abraham, or it's a reference to a covenant ceremony that was just known at the time.
Right, yeah.
The piece missing from the Abraham story, which we read in Jeremiah, is that the pieces were dissected into two, and then, according to the covenant ritual, the parties would walk between the two pieces, and then there would have been an offering to the gods of what remained of the animal carcasses, which apparently is why Abraham drove away the vultures who tried to consume the carcasses.
Yeah, so that verse from Jeremiah, like how it compares to this earlier one with the ritual, is that we're talking about how he said when the vultures came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. But what Jeremiah said is that he's basically going to let the vultures and the wild animals come down and eat the carcasses.
Right, yeah, because they broke the covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really interesting observation. I appreciate that. It seems here that maybe Jeremiah was trying to make a reference to the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah. Mm.
All right, Dan, let's move into 13 and 15. Can you read those verses?
Then he said to Abram, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and will serve them, and they will afflict them 400 years. And also the nation whom they serve I will judge. Afterward they shall come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age."
Yeah, that's interesting, the phrase, "you shall go to your fathers,"
Yeah, it's very interesting.
as though there's somewhere he's going after death.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's either a euphemism, like, hey, we all die in the end, here's my corpse next to yours,
Right.
or this is proof that even back then there was a heaven, or at least the idea of one, or they believed in one, huh?
Yeah, some kind of dwelling of the afterlife. Whether it was good or bad, there was something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the problem is, of course, whether we take these at face value as God breathed, or as the imagination of the later writers who were trying to convince people to follow their religious variant instead.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, if I were to believe in the Bible, like in the God-breathed nature of it, I guess this could be used as proof of an afterlife. But as we've seen, it appears that a lot of the Bible was just influenced by events many, many years in the future. And there were ulterior motives for everything.
I mean, it feels that way. Even here in 13, when we hear God talking to Abraham, he says, "Know certainly that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, and they will serve them." Well, this is a foreshadowing of the servitude in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And we've already seen here the narrator kind of setting up Egypt and the other descendants of Ham as being bad people. It certainly feels like all these passages were written rather late. And of course, we know that a lot of them were, both by the language and by references, like, up until, even until today.
Yeah.
Oh, well, when is today? It certainly wasn't at the time of the setting where the events happened.
Yeah. I just think, it feels like they know the future. And so they're
Right.
writing the past so that it coincides with what actually happened,
It certainly feels that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is really intriguing in part of this prophecy, it states in 16, "But in the fourth generation, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete." And Dan, you had a really good comment on this. The one thing that stuck out at me when I read this for the first time again as we were doing the study was the fourth generation.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
if they're in Egypt for 400 years, how is it that the fourth generation is going to return? Are they referring to generations of 100 years?
I mean, that's how we refer to it, right?
A generation is 100 years?
Yeah.
I think it's usually 40.
Oh, really?
Between you and your offspring?
Oh.
I mean,
Okay.
technically, if we assume Abraham is the new standard, where your first son is not born until you're 100,
Right.
100 years old,
Yeah.
maybe 400 years and 4 generations works.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I don't have an answer for
I know,
that.
so it was just,
Yeah.
you're born and then you die. That's 100 years. That's your generation.
I don't think that is the traditional sense of the word.
That's perfectly fine.
But nevertheless, you had a note about the Amorites here.
Yeah. So it says the fourth generation, yada, yada. The point is, so one day they will return. Is this proof that even generational sins wane and die eventually?
Yeah, so the reason for their returning is because the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete, meaning God needs them
right?
to return, right, to give the divine punishment.
Yeah, but it's not going to last forever.
Oh, certainly is not going to last forever. Well, they're supposed to be wiping out the Amorites, remember?
Oh.
The Amorites are going to go bye-bye.
And then they won't have any generational sins.
Right.
It all worked out.
Yeah. I think the sentence here makes it seem as though the time of writing had to have been after the Israelites dealt with the Amorites.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Of course, if you are a believer in the traditional biblical viewpoints, you would just say, well, all this is prophetic. And so this proves that, God is here because we have these texts that
How many times have people said that?
predict these events.
Yeah, they've used the Old Testament to predict the New Testament,
Yeah.
It's like,
Yeah, and that's a really interesting topic. We're going to hit that when we get to the prophets. And this is a very difficult topic because I find it very difficult to find in the prophets the messianic figure that we see in Jesus.
See, that's a surprise because I definitely disagree with you.
Right.
So.
And that's great. And I think, once again, we'll have to reserve this larger discussion. I think the reason is there are kind of two ways to read the prophets. The first way is to take the immediate context. And the second way is to apply a second meaning to everything. And that's why almost all of the prophetic texts that we see in the New Testament, they're relying on the prophecy having a second meaning.
Yeah, it's true.
And I just don't believe that the prophecies had a second meaning. I think, but once again, we're going to get there when we get to the prophets. We don't want to rob Abraham of his time in the sun here. Let's read 18 through 20.
Sure.
On the same day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, "To your descendants I have given you this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates, the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Cadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites." So, I mean, again, we got the Rephaim coming up. We're not going to belabor this point.
Still around.
But it is just intriguing that these offspring of angels and women keep showing up. Dan, what were your thoughts on these verses?
It's too bad nobody else had a say in this.
Right.
I mean, of course, none of this really matters because it's merely written based on whoever had been conquered when the piece was written. My guess is that maybe things have changed since then.
Yeah, I mean...
Which means it's not really a prophecy. It's not even history. It's just history of a single moment in time that by now could be proven wrong.
Well, I think these people groups, they did exist. And we know that they were pushed out of Canaan by a Semitic-speaking peoples, which seems to correlate with the conquest narrative. And we know that a large group of Semitic-speaking people did actually rule in Egypt for a period and then become slaves and then be essentially expelled from Egypt into the land of Canaan.
That stuff is true.
Oh, yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
Is it really?
Oh, yeah, we have the archaeological data for that.
Really?
Yeah, I'm the largest skeptic in the room typically in terms of Old Testament archaeology, but in terms of what went on between the Semitic-speaking people and the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, we have a pretty ample evidence of both the migration patterns of the Semitic-speaking peoples as well as what they were doing in Egypt and what happened when they left Egypt.
So the land of Canaan, is that where the 12 tribes were living?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah. So on that front, and when we get to Exodus, we're going to have a ball going over archaeological data
Okay, good.
that quote-unquote proves some of the historicity that we read in Exodus.
Yeah, I've read a lot about, the proof that the Israelites were actually existed.
Yeah, it's a real thing. They actually did. So we're going to have a lot of fun there, and I'm sure some people will try to poo-poo on the Exodus was real parade. But,
yeah, well, I mean, that's very easy to do.
Sure.
Which is why, you're going to have to bring out the big guns.
Yeah, we're going to do a whole episode on that
We
one.
need some smoking guns here.
We're going to smoke some guns. We're going to have some smoking guns.
Yeah, that's better.
I mean, neither one of us are pro-violence, so I don't even know where we're going to acquire guns from.
Right, all right. Smoking peace signs, I
We'll
guess.
do finger guns.
That's what we'll do.
Let's move into chapter 16. Chapter 16, we read about Abraham and we get introduced to Ishmael.
Okay.
This is a very special topic. Dan, can you read verse 1 in 16 for us?
Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maidservant whose name was Hagar.
Yeah, some interesting things happening there.
Yep.
This is the first instance in the scriptures where we read about a woman having no children or being barren. But this is a popular motif, and it is usually used to set up a miraculous birth.
Now, I mean, she had children before this, right?
Oh, no.
Oh, really?
No.
Abraham had no children?
None.
Up to this point?
None. Remember?
Right? Where did everybody else come from?
Well, he didn't have any children, but they must have been cousins of his or born to the slaves in the household. Remember, his only heir was Eleazar?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Still seems really odd.
Yeah, I mean, not everyone can have children.
Yeah, but in the Bible.
The Lord has yet to open her womb, as they say.
Yeah. Okay.
Sure. Is there any significance in the maidservant being Egyptian?
Well, obviously. Yeah, because the Egyptians were the bad guys.
Yeah, I found that to be interesting as well. I'm not sure if there's any foreshadowing here, but it is at least interesting that the maidservant is Egyptian. What message is being conveyed, I don't know just yet.
I mean, we'll figure it out pretty soon, though, right?
We may. We'll see. Can you read your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this is just another verse about not trusting God despite being the face of a new religion, right? I mean, it must be about Abraham. I know the whole imperfect vessel thing, whatever, but I also feel as though maybe these people are just not that bright, and God should have tried harder to find a better representative.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to shows up in verse 2 where it says, Sarai said to Abram, "See now the Lord has restrained me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I shall obtain a child by her." And Abram heeded the voice of Sarai. Now, it seems here that Abraham is displaying a severe lack of faith.
Mm-hmm. I mean, same with David,
Yeah.
Samson, Solomon. Yeah. In fact,
there's no end.
You know what they all have in common, though?
Lack of faith and character?
Try again.
Tell me.
A lust for women.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's one of the surprising things, but maybe not too surprising things about the Old Testament is the readily accepted male lust of women.
Mm-hmm.
Men are not expected to have any amount of self-control. It's like a given. Men are just designed to lust after women, and women are designed to be objects of the male lust.
Mm.
That to me is problematic.
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like, I don't want to speak for a whole gender, but I feel like if I were female and I was reading this, like nowadays even, I'd be like, wow, and I want to be a Christian?
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
And I hear, the story of Abraham, and I think, oh, Abraham, what a knucklehead. Because I kind of put myself as a male, I read the Bible through the lens of the other males.
Mm-hmm.
But if you read the Bible through the lens of a poor female, oh man, that poor maidservant that had to sleep with Abraham. Let's imagine, for example, that the maidservant was, we'll say, still somewhere in her prime. Having no discernible will of her own, is now forced to sleep with her master's husband, who is at least twice her age. It seems like a terrible thing to force a young or even a middle-aged woman to have to do.
Mm-hmm.
But yet here it is, God's chosen father of many, deciding, hey, this is a thing that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And the more striking thing is it was Abram's wife who suggested it. Now, I don't know what most people's marriages are like, but I suspect there's a lot of guys out there where if their wife said, hey, maybe you should sleep with the help, how many are going to say no to that?
I have to assume a lot of them.
The good ones.
Well, yeah.
The ones that value.
And the other ones are going to be like, this is a trap.
Oh, yeah.
So
That would be my first thought is, no, this is a trap. This is not going to end well. We see in the scriptures that it doesn't end well.
Right.
What is interesting, though, is there seems to be an assumption that what Sarai was doing was okay.
Right, yeah.
If there was not an existing covenant in place.
Yeah, actually, that's true. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Any other thoughts before we move on to 3 through 5?
No, that's just messed up.
Yeah, it's a little something. It's painful to read.
It really is. And I'm a male.
I know.
I don't know if I could.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could have this faith as a female. You know what I mean?
It is difficult. I often think, well, if I read my sister or one of my sisters into that passage, it's very difficult because if that is happening to my sister, I would be up in arms in real life.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Let's go ahead and read the next couple of verses, though. Dan?
Sure. Then Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan. So he went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress became despised in her eyes, despite that this was her idea. Then Sarai said to Abram, my wrong be upon you. I gave my maid into your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, I became despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between you and me, because it's, of course, Abraham's fault.
Yeah, there's a problem here.
Yeah, a little bit.
Right. So it seems that Sarai's bad judgment has come back to bite her.
Right.
In that she was so eager to have an offspring that she didn't think that if her maidservant actually conceived, her maidservant wouldn't want to become the primary wife.
Well, listen, it says right here, gave her to her husband to be his wife.
That's right.
Is this just some colloquialism or?
No, that's real. So there were multiple tiers of wifehood that you could have. Your first wife is usually the head wife.
Okay.
Now, you can take on another wife, and she could become your second wife, or she could even become your concubine. Concubine is a lower status where your job is basically to have sex and babies with your husband. You have no real status within the household. In fact, we read of some concubines in the Old Testament that did not even live in the same house as their husbands.
I'm surprised Abraham didn't have concubines before this, though, right?
It seems likely that he did have concubines.
Except he didn't make any children, right?
Well, that's what I'm saying is it seems likely that he did have concubines, being that there were 318 people born within his household.
Okay.
However, it seems clear from the passage that while there was a lot of baby making going on, his baby making batter may not have been, causing any reproduction.
Makes sense.
But in a household that large, would it have been normal for Abraham to have concubines? Oh, absolutely. That'd be in keeping with the times. So,
was that a sin?
Was it a sin for Abraham to have
Concubines, yes.
According to the scriptures, not really.
But it's a sin now.
Not really.
All right, let's continue.
I think the sin is, having sex with somebody outside of marriage, but polygamy is not necessarily condemned in the Bible. It gets sort of sideways poked at, meaning a lot of the narrators kind of mention polygamy and then detail the negative results that come from it without explicitly just saying, yeah, polygamy is a bad idea. God never forbids it. But we do know that Adam and Eve were created side by side, meant to become one flesh. He didn't create Adam and Eve and Ava and anyone else. It was just one man, one woman. And that seems to be the ideal scenario.
It's weird that it's not really a sin, I guess, and yet we made it illegal.
Right.
Isn't that weird?
That's just our modern sensibilities being forced upon the biblical text. Right? Let's go ahead and read 6.
Okay.
So Abram said to Sarai, "Indeed, your maid is in your hand. Do to her as you please." And when Sarai dealt harshly with her, she fled from her presence. So
that's messed up. I don't care who you are.
The maltreatment of Hagar by Sarai is disturbing, but the frustrating part for me was the fact that Abram allowed it. Because technically Abram was in charge of the household. Yeah. If his wife got out of hand, it was his job to say, hey, maybe don't treat her that way.
Right.
That's not the way we do business. But here, Abram's like, do what you want.
He wasn't much of a man, was he?
He does not strike me as the type of man so far that we would want to look up to.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. You had some thoughts written down on verse 6. Can you share some of those?
All right. So, you want to kill her? Is that what you're saying? Because if that's what you're saying, then just say it. Abraham don't care. He got what he wanted. Hagar was just a means to an end for him, which is weird because it's not like having a child is going to help him any. He doesn't get to die and then take all that stuff with him, regardless of who his heir is. I hate these legacies. Without a child to pass on the great name of whatever Abraham's last name is, he might have been forgotten.
Yeah. So
we don't even know his last name. Did he have a last name? He didn't have a last name.
Isn't that interesting that there's so much weight given to the descendants and the legacy as if that's supposed to mean something to us?
Yeah. That means nothing to us, right?
And the Christian faith has nothing to do with tribalism or collectivism. It's all about individual salvation.
Right. Yeah. Because, none of this matters. You go to heaven. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah.
What happens to your descendants is your descendants' business.
Right, yeah.
Right. There almost seems to be a remnant of the old ancient Near East built into the text, which is indicating that, your immortality is your legacy. if your legacy carries on, then you never technically die.
Yeah. Mm.
Of course, in the ancient Near East, there were also cults of the dead or cults of the fathers as well, where this is where we start to get into Canaanite religion, where you were buried and it was expected that your sons and your offspring, but primarily your sons, would return to your burial sites or your cave where your dead body was stored and would bring you food and sustenance to sustain you in the afterlife. So dying without any descendants
Okay.
actually provides an afterlife that is less pleasing. So making sure you have those male descendants was important to make sure that you were cared for after you died.
Huh.
And we see this carried over into Israel religion because there are many burial sites within Israel or in Palestine where we can tell ancient Israelites were buried, and we can tell that by their names because we do have distinct Israelite names that were buried. And we see within their burial tombs, usually caves or hollowed out rock, we see food and other items that were left for them as a means to sustain them.
How could anybody believe that, though, when there are so many people who died? I mean, that's got to be a ton of people who didn't have anybody to leave them food, right?
Yeah, and
it seems like a religion invented by rich people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Who know they're going to have a bunch of sons to give them a bunch of food.
That's a really good point. What percentage of the ancient world in Abraham's time even had offspring to take care of them? Abraham would have been one of the few in the narrative that would have had some sort of fulfilling afterlife or some sort of legacy. Everyone else, the majority of the people are just casualties.
So if he hadn't had, whatever his name is.
Abram?
Huh?
Abram?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If he hadn't had that child of his.
Ishmael.
Mm-hmm. Then the idea is he would not have had a good afterlife.
Well, I think that's implied, but I don't think that's the main point of the story. You know what I mean?
Mm. But this was just, stuff they still believed when they were writing this.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say yes to that.
Which is, it's interesting how Christianity has evolved, or religion, Christianity, what have you.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. And that's part of the progressive revelation, if that makes sense, what we talked about before. Let's read 7 through 8. Dan, can you read those?
It's crazy to have a progressive revelation since, only people in the future will get it, and then everybody else is screwed.
Right.
They don't get to know any of this stuff.
Well, it's not fake prophecy as long as you make up a fancy name for it, like progressive revelation.
Great. All right, what are we doing?
7 through 8.
Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai. Yeah.
I feel like this is the part where you get to put yourself in the story, because if I'm the maidservant, I'm doing the same exact thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. I feel like when you read this part, you're kind of rooting for her.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Of course, that must mean that we're supposed to, or else they wouldn't have written it like that, right?
Right. Exactly. They could have made it sounded very different.
Right, yeah.
He who has the pen gets to...
Yeah.
gets to write the story. So the angel,
sure.
Right? It says, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur.
Yeah.
And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, where have you come from and where are you going? And then the angel comes with some instruction. It says, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit yourself under her hand. Ooh.
Yeah, that's messed up right there, huh?
And then the angel of the Lord said to her, I will multiply your descendants exceedingly, so that they shall not be counted for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are with child, and you shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has heard your affliction. So maybe that softens the blow a little bit. Like, hey, you got to go back and get maltreated. However, you are going to have an offspring, and he's going to become a great nation.
I mean, again, I guess that's one of those things that probably mattered more back in that day than it does now, right?
Right.
I mean, if I was told I'm going to be beaten, but I'll have a kid or something, not so great.
Well, not only that, I think there's an implication here that her offspring will be able to take care of her in her older age. So, especially as a woman, because we think about she's young. Sarah and Abraham are much older than her.
She's a slave.
She's essentially a concubine.
Who takes care of a slave?
Or a second status wife.
Yeah.
Abraham's eventually going to die.
Yeah.
And then who's going to take care of her? She's got to have a son or some other descendants that will be able to take care of her, or else she has to marry the next of kin to Abraham, which presumably would be dead. The irony of the story, though, is that Abraham lives to 170 years, so she probably actually died before him.
Yeah.
I mean, nevertheless, it's just a strange happening altogether. Could the Lord not have said, okay, I'm going to provide you some relief and freedom from Sarah and Abraham and make a place for you here, you and your son and your offspring?
Yeah, it's like he's condoning this, right?
It feels that way, right? He condones the maltreatment.
And yet he's still like, I know it sucks, so I'll make it a little better for you.
Right.
So I don't get that,
But it's going to suck more because Ishmael is about to receive quasi-curse.
Yeah.
Dan, can you read 12 through 14?
Sure. He shall be a wild man. His hand shall be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees. For she said, Have I also seen him who sees me? Therefore the well was called Bir Laroy. Something like that. Observe, it is between Kadesh and Bored.
Yeah, thanks for that. So,
Yeah.
Ishmael, having done nothing wrong,
Yeah, well, yep.
is going to be kind of cursed. His lineage is going to be up against his brother's lineage.
He didn't do anything wrong. She didn't do anything wrong. Why does he get cursed here?
And so this is the interesting thing is there seems to be, for the second time in Genesis, kind of a cursing of lineages. And it's not entirely clear that the curse is warranted.
Right.
But
I mean, I know there's some argument that says, okay, God had a plan, and it doesn't really matter how it got ruined because it was a righteous plan, and so somebody has to be punished, because God is great. Isn't that how that works, But I also think to us humans, that doesn't seem very fair, and we get our morality and sense of fairness from God, right?
yeah.
Not to say atheists aren't moral, but I think you get what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Dan, I was also reminded here of the curse of Reuben, where he's cursed because he slept with one of Jacob's wives or concubines, Bilhah. So it's interesting that, Reuben's offspring are punished for Reuben's actions. And that seems to be perfectly okay within the text of the scriptures.
I mean, that's Adam and Eve, right?
Yeah.
We're all punished for his actions.
Right. Everybody is punished through the sin of one couple.
Yeah.
Yeah. And while that seems wild to us in the modern time, this made perfect sense in the ancient times.
Right. So, can you back up?
Mm-hmm.
So it says, therefore the well was called Beer Laroy or Roy.
Mm-hmm.
It is between Kadesh and Bered. So, is it? Is it still there? Do we have proof of this?
That's a really good question. I've not looked in to see if there's a well there, but we do find a number of ancient wells from this time period.
Oh.
Yeah, we've got some ancient wells. In fact, we read about one in the New Testament, which was Jacob's well, which Jesus met with the woman who had 5 husbands.
Okay. Wait, what?
Remember when Jesus met the woman who had multiple husbands?
5 husbands.
Yeah.
No, usually the husband has multiple wives, right?
Well, there was a Samaritan woman at the well who had 5 husbands.
Oh.
Not at once.
Not at the same time. That was really,
Not at the same time.
Had.
And that well is an ancestral well that had existed from the time of Jacob up until the time of Jesus.
Okay.
So you got about
and Jacob's
1900 years there.
Right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So.
Because Ishmael is the father of Jacob. Is that right?
No.
Isaac is the father of Jacob.
That's right.
Got it.
Yep. Isaac and Ishmael are basically competing brothers now, right? Yeah. So Isaac is the blessed son and Ishmael is the cursed son of Abraham.
Yeah. Which is, I mean, that's how it's always been with this, where usually it's that the firstborn son gets everything, but following throughout the Bible, it's always the secondborn or lastborn or what have you.
That's right. And you know what? Eventually, maybe when we get to Jacob and Esau, we're going to have a big discussion on a theological concept usually referred to as primacy of the second son. And according to me and a few other scholars that I tend to agree with, I think the primacy of the second son is basically kind of a subtext referring to the primacy of Judah over Israel. Judah being the second son historically, Israel being the first son. However, Israel is conquered by the Akkadians and Judah is left standing.
Okay, you're talking about the tribes, the towns, what have you.
Mm-hmm. There's a whole subtext in the Old Testament that basically is foreshadowing the second son being we'll say the blessed and the victorious son. And we see that in the competition between Judah in the south and Israel in the north, whereas Judah ends up being the last one standing. And so certainly when you retell these stories, it's going to be the younger son. Their primacy is emphasized because it's a foreshadowing of what God is doing.
The first shall be last and the last shall be first.
That's right.
All right, let us bow our heads. Oh, okay. Go ahead.
All right. Thanks for watching. We appreciate all the views. And if you have questions, leave them in the comments. I thought you were going to add something to that.
And thank you for the things.
Like and subscribe.
Oh, yeah. Like and subscribe.